The carrots came off the sorting line in waves, striking the steel chute, bouncing once on the gravel and rolling into a heap beside the loading bay where nobody had bothered to spread a tarp. Some were bent like elbows, some split into two thick legs. Others twisted around themselves so tightly that dirt still clung in the grooves after washing. None of that mattered to the men loading trucks for the supermarkets. Shape was enough. Uniformity had a buyer. Everything else had a disposal bill. By 9 that morning, the rejected pile weighed 11,400 pounds. The good carrots went into waxed boxes beneath fluorescent lights. The crooked ones went outside. Harlan Petrie saw them from the cab of his pickup while he waited for a pallet of feed sacks to clear the driveway. He was 47, narrow through the shoulders, with cracked skin around both thumbs and a brown work coat polished dark at the cuffs from years of use. 3 seasons earlier, a hailstorm had stripped his vegetable ground badly enough that he had sold half his equipment before winter. Since then, he had developed the habit of looking twice at anything somebody else called worthless. He shut off the truck and walked toward the pile. A forklift backed past him, its alarm chirping against the rattle of the packing line. Carrot tops, broken tips, and wet clods of black soil had collected along the concrete edge. Harlan crouched and picked up one root that had forked just below the shoulder. It was heavy in his palm, bright orange under a smear of dirt, and firm when he pressed his thumbnail against the crown. He turned it once, then again. It was not hunger that held him there, it was attention. Harlan looked toward the loading bay where another bin tipped and sent several hundred more roots sliding down the chute. Nobody came running after them. Nobody separated the sound ones from the spoiled ones. To the shed, they had already crossed a line that could not be crossed back. He held the forked carrot at eye level and said, mostly to himself, "Crooked isn't the same as useless." The line kept moving. By afternoon, that orange mound would be hauled away as cull waste, and the gravel beneath it would show nothing except damp soil and tire tracks. Harlan did not yet know how many of those roots were sound enough to survive winter, how many would rot, or how much trouble would follow if he tried to save them. But he knew one thing before he climbed back into his truck. If he could keep the right roots alive until spring, that empty patch beyond his barn would not stay empty. First, he had to convince the packing shed to let him take home 11,400 pounds of carrots nobody wanted. If stories like this are worth keeping alive, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what town, county, or state you're watching from. Harlan Petrie did not know what those rejected carrots would become yet. He only knew the cull truck was coming that afternoon, and he had a few hours to decide what could be saved. Harlan Petrie was 47 that fall, narrow through the shoulders, sunburned across the back of his neck, with 2 fingers on his left hand that never closed completely after a corn picker caught his glove 11 years earlier. He farmed 46 acres outside St. Louis in Gratiot County, Michigan, on ground his father had called enough land for a careful man and not enough for a careless one. By 2014, Harlan knew careful men could still run short of money. His wife Mara had died 6 years earlier after a fast illness that left him with hospital parking receipts he could not throw away. Since then, he had kept the farm by narrowing everything: fewer hired hours, older equipment, seed bought between discounts and price increases. He patched hydraulic hose until the braid showed silver, and kept a coffee can of bent bolts, because bent was not the same thing as broken. The best ground lay north of the house, 28 acres of dark loam draining toward a county ditch. The worst lay behind an old line of box elders, where 6.5 acres sagged lower than the rest. People around there called it the sinker patch. In a wet spring, tractor tires pressed water up through the soil. In a dry August, the surface baked into plates that cracked wide enough to swallow a pocket knife blade. Harlan's father had tried corn there, then oats, then alfalfa, and finally quit spending seed on it. What remained was foxtail, burdock, and 2 rusted fence posts leaning toward each other. At the edge of that patch sat the wash house, a low concrete block building with a corrugated roof and 3 cloudy windows. It had been built when Harlan was a boy for washing table potatoes. The washer was gone. The drain still crossed the floor. A wooden sorting bench sagged against one wall, and mice had chewed the bottom of the door. Nobody had used the building for 12 years. That October, it mattered for one reason. Harlan owed First County Agricultural Bank $18,600 on the operating note that had carried fuel, fertilizer, and repairs through the season. The due date was December 27th. After what he could cover from soybeans, custom tillage, and stored corn, he would still be short $4,820. There were 72 days left. He had already sold a gravity wagon. He had delayed replacing the well pump by learning which breaker to kick when the motor hummed and refused to start. He had stopped eating breakfast at Miller's Cafe because $5.75, multiplied often enough, became a number he could feel. What he had not done was call the auctioneer. The farm had been in the Petrie family since 1948. Harlan did not talk about keeping it that way because saying it aloud sounded sentimental, and sentiment did not lower principle. He simply worked later. 2 mornings after he saw the rejected carrots at Mercer Packing Shed, Harlan entered the wash house carrying a broom, a pry bar, and a yellow legal pad. Dust lifted through the east window. He scraped mouse nests from the corners, pulled loose boards from the bench, and stood over the old floor drain. On the legal pad, he wrote 3 things. December 27th, $4,820, 11,400 pounds. Then he circled the last number twice because before crooked carrots could become anything useful, he first had to get legal possession of a pile everybody else had already decided was worthless. Glenn Mercer did not say no when Harlan came back to the packing shed. He said something harder to argue with. "What exactly are you planning to do with them?" Glenn Mercer was 55, broad through the chest with a gray mustache clipped square over his lip and a pencil behind his right ear. 10 years earlier, one rejected truckload had cost his family shed a grocery contract large enough to put 3 seasonal crews out of work. Since then, Glenn trusted written specifications more than enthusiasm. Harlan looked through the open bay door at the coal pile. "I want the whole lot." "Whole lot is 11,400 pounds. "I know." "You planning to feed them?" "No." Glenn waited. "I want to keep them alive." For several seconds, only the washer motor spoke. Glenn did not laugh. That made the question feel more serious. Harlan asked for a sale instead of a favor. $1 for the entire rejected lot, with loading, hauling, storage, spoilage, and every consequence after pickup belonging to him. Glenn walked into the office. The receipt came from a carbon copy pad beside the scale tickets. Glenn wrote the date, identified lot 14C, wrote 11,400 pounds, and added that the rejected carrot lot was sold and transferred in full to Harlan Petrie for $1, with removal and responsibility passing to the buyer upon pickup. Harlan read every line before he signed. Glenn tapped the paper. "Keep your copy." Harlan folded the yellow sheet once and put it inside the metal cash box behind his truck seat. By 10:30, he had backed his flatbed wagon beside the pile. The shed loader could move the carrots quickly, but Harlan would not let Glenn dump them loose from bucket height. He borrowed produce bins, lined the wagon floor with old rubber belting, and loaded in shallower layers so the roots at the bottom would not take the full weight. October wind carried wet soil across the yard. Leonard Pike walked over from the diesel pumps when he saw the second bin go aboard. Leonard Pike was 61, long-faced and stooped, with a white scar running from his jaw toward his left ear. A bankruptcy after 2 bad onion years had taught him to distrust anything that needed time before it paid. "You buying rejects now, Harlan?" $1. Leonard looked at the wagon. "Dollar is the cheap part." At 3:15, Harlan pulled the first load onto County Road 600. The wagon tires flattened slightly under the weight. He drove 18 miles an hour because every pothole made the bins shift. It took 4 trips before the last roots disappeared from the packing shed yard. On the 3rd trip, Marjorie Voss slowed her pickup beside the wash house. Marjorie Voss was 68, small and straight-backed, with silver hair cut close around her ears. She had lost 2 acres of strawberries to root disease in one summer, and never again believed that healthy-looking crops were necessarily healthy underneath. "What are you going to do when half of those rot?" she called. Harlan rested both hands on the top bin. Figure out which half before they do. That sounds expensive. It probably is. By dusk, every bin was inside the old wash house, and the floor carried the sweet green smell of fresh roots and damp earth. Harlan locked the door, slid Glenn's receipt beneath the yellow legal pad on the workbench, and counted the rows of bins once more. 11,400 pounds had made it home. What Harlan did not know was how many pounds were worth saving, or how to tell before winter answered for him. Earl Whitmore arrived the next morning in a brown Ford pickup, with one headlight clouded yellow and a wooden produce crate strapped behind the cab. He was 79, tall even, with his back bent forward, with white eyebrows heavy enough to shade his eyes and hands permanently thickened at the knuckles. The first two fingers of his right hand leaned sideways from arthritis. For 38 years, Earl had grown carrot roots for seed on rented ground west of Alma, saving mother roots through winter and setting them back out after cold treatment in spring. He stopped after his wife, June, died and his last contract buyer shifted production to larger, specialized growers. The seed work had not vanished. It had simply moved far enough away that a small farmer no longer needed to know how to do it. Harlan had called him because Glenn Mercer remembered seeing Earl inspect seed roots with a pocket knife 20 years earlier. Earl walked into the wash house, looked at the stacked bins, and did not touch anything for nearly a minute. "You bought all that?" $1. That was the easy mistake. Harlan smiled once. Earl did not. He pulled a carrot from the nearest bin, held it by the shoulder, pressed his thumb beside the crown, then turned it slowly under the window light. The root bent left, split near the bottom, and would never have passed a grocery specification. Earl set it on the bench. Crooked can come from ground, injury, spacing, plenty of things, he said. But seed work is not a pardon for every bad root. You save sound roots. You do not save disease because you feel sorry for it. That was the first test. They began with the crowns. A carrot meant to live through winter needed an intact growing point at the top. Roots whose crowns had been cut too deeply during harvest, split by machinery, crushed under the loader, or torn badly enough to expose wet tissue went into a separate bin. Earl made Harlan press each questionable crown with a bare thumb instead of judging by color alone. By noon, they had rejected 1,260 pounds for damaged crowns and harvest wounds. 11,400 became 10,140. Then Earl changed the test. Softness came before smell on some roots and after it on others. He showed Harlan how a healthy carrot resisted steady thumb pressure, while a root beginning to break down gave slightly beneath the skin or carried a sweet, sour odor around a wound. Diseased or rotten roots were not candidates for storage. They were removed completely because one failing root pressed among sound roots could become a source of trouble during months of cold storage. They found 980 pounds with soft spots, wet lesions, or active decay. 10,140 became 9,160. The last pass took longer because Earl stopped looking for damage and started looking for plants worth asking another year from. Carrots were biennial plants. A sound root could survive a period of cold, then, after replanting, use its stored reserves to send up leaves, flower stalks, and eventually seed. But Earl refused roots that were pencil-thin at the shoulder, badly shattered into weak forks, or so undersized that they carried little reserve. He also set aside obvious off-types that did not belong with the rest of the lot. Harlan watched another 640 pounds leave the count. 9,160 became 8,520. Earl wrote the figure on the yellow legal pad, underlining it once. "That is what you have," he said. Harlan looked at the rejected bins, then at the rows still waiting along the wall. Nearly 3,000 pounds were already gone, and winter had not started. Earl picked up one of the remaining roots, trimmed a dead leaf stem without touching the center of the crown, and laid the carrot back down carefully. "Now comes the part that kills them slow," he said. Outside, the temperature was dropping, and the old wash house had no refrigeration, no humidity control, and no system for keeping 8,520 pounds of living roots alive until spring. Earl came back with a carpenter's thermometer, 2 galvanized vent covers, hardware cloth, and a coffee can full of screws that had already been used once. Harlan had spent the night moving bins away from the outside walls. The washhouse smelled colder in the morning, but beads of moisture had formed on the north window. Earl rubbed one away with his thumb. "That is what you watch. Water?" Where the water came from. Carrots in storage were still alive. They were not growing much, but they were respiring, using stored sugars and oxygen while releasing carbon dioxide, water, and some heat. Packed too warm, they burned through reserves faster. Packed too dry, they lost water and shriveled. Packed wet without enough air movement, wounded tissue could become a starting point for decay. The old seed growers Earl had learned from did not try to make roots dry. They tried to keep them cold, moist, and breathing. For carrots held as mother roots, Earl wanted the storage space just above freezing. He explained that carrots could be overwintered in moist sand at roughly 32 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand slowed moisture loss without wrapping every root in standing water, while the cold slowed respiration and supplied the winter exposure the plants needed before flowering the next season. "The trick," Earl said, "is that cold and wet are not the same thing." They built a room inside the room. Harlan framed an enclosure along the shaded north wall with salvaged 2x4s and rigid insulation from the machine shed. He left an air gap against the concrete block and lowered the ceiling to 7 feet, so they were not trying to control the whole washhouse. At the bottom of the west wall, Earl had him cut a fresh air opening and cover it with hardware cloth. Near the opposite upper corner, they cut a second opening for warmer air to escape. Each got a sliding plywood shutter. "Low air comes in," Earl said. "Warm air finds the high hole." The bins changed too. Harlan spread clean, damp sand across the bottom, set the roots in a shallow layer with space around the crowns, then covered the carrot bodies with more sand without burying the crowns in a wet mass. Earl squeezed a fistful and opened his hand. The sand held lightly, then broke when he touched it. "If water runs out, you went too far." Harlan wrote that on the legal pad. By late afternoon, a system had appeared where there had been only bins. One thermometer hung at shoulder height. A second sat low near the incoming vent because Earl said the coldest air mattered most when freezing was the danger. Harlan numbered every bin from 1 through 36. Then he drew 36 boxes on the legal pad, leaving room beside each for temperature, moisture, odor, firmness, and anything removed during inspection. 8,520 pounds remained in the ledger, and now Harlan knew exactly where every part of that number was sitting. The routine began before breakfast. At 5:40 each morning, Harlan unlocked the washhouse, read both thermometers before touching a vent, then walked the rows without moving a root. He smelled first. After that came the glass, walls, and underside of the lowest rack, looking for condensation. Only then did he open selected bins and press crowns near the corners and centers. At noon, he checked again. After sunset, he adjusted the shutters by inches instead of throwing them fully open. A small thermostatically controlled electric heater sat outside the storage enclosure, ready only to keep the room from dropping below freezing during a hard Michigan night. On the third day, the outside temperature climbed unexpectedly into the upper 50s. Harlan found the room above 40 degrees after lunch, opened both vents wider, and watched the temperature fall again by evening. Nothing smelled wrong. That small success changed him. For the next 2 days, he checked more often, misted sand whenever the surface looked pale, and closed the vents earlier whenever the night forecast sounded harsh. He began treating every change as something he could prevent if he noticed it soon enough. On the 6th evening, Earl stood in the doorway while Harlan pushed the lower shutter nearly closed. "You sure about that?" Earl asked. 27 tonight. I am not letting these freeze." Earl watched him close the opening until only a narrow black line remained. He did not tell Harlan to open it again. He looked instead toward the damp sand and living roots, where 8,520 pounds were breathing inside a room Harlan had worked very hard to protect. For 3 mornings, Harlan believed the room was working exactly the way he had hoped. The thermometers stayed above freezing. The sand felt cool and damp. When he pressed the crowns in the first 6 bins, they stayed firm beneath his thumb. He wrote the temperatures down, circled each good reading, and closed the lower vent a little earlier every evening as the nights sharpened. On the 4th morning, the north window was white with condensation. Harlan wiped it with his sleeve and kept moving. By noon, the glass had fogged again. The room smelled heavier too, not rotten yet, but sweet in a way fresh carrots were not supposed to smell. He opened bin 12 and found moisture collected along the inside wall, where the damp sand had settled tighter around the roots. Earl arrived just after 1. He stopped at the doorway. "Do not touch anything." Harlan stood with one hand on the bin. Earl crossed the room slowly, checked the upper thermometer, then the lower one, then pressed his palm against the concrete wall. He opened bin 12, lifted 3 roots from the edge and laid them on the bench. The first was sound. The second had a dark wet patch beneath the crown. The third bent under Earl's thumb. He cut it lengthwise with his pocket knife. The tissue inside had gone watery around the wound. Harlan looked toward the shutters. "I kept the cold out. You kept the air out too." It was not bad luck. It came directly from Harlan's instinct to protect what he had been given. He had tried so hard to prevent freezing and drying that he had reduced the exchange of air while keeping the sand wet. Stored carrots kept respiring. Their cells continued using oxygen and stored sugars, and they continued releasing heat, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. In a cold room with some ventilation, that process stayed slow. In Harlan's tighter room, moisture had nowhere useful to go. The warmest air rose, met colder surfaces, and condensed. Damp pockets formed against bin walls and around wounded roots. Those wounds gave decay organisms an easier place to enter. Earl pointed at the window. "That glass warned you before the carrots did." Harlan said nothing. They opened every bin. The damage was not uniform. Roots near the center of some stacks were firm and cold. Roots along several outer walls were slick at the shoulder or beginning to soften where they touched damp sand. Earl made Harlan remove every questionable root, not just the ones already collapsing. "Why this one?" Harlan asked, holding a carrot that looked clean except for a shallow bruise. "Because you are storing until spring, not until supper." By late afternoon, the rejected roots filled 5 shallow bins outside the enclosure. Harlan weighed each one on the platform scale, wrote the figures on the legal pad and added them twice. 730 pounds. 8,520 became 7,790. Harlan stared at the number longer than he had stared at the bank balance. "I tried so hard not to lose them that I stopped letting them breathe." Earl cleaned his knife on a rag. "That is about the size of it." The sentence landed harder because Earl did not soften it. They carried the spoiled roots out before dark and spread them away from the wash house, instead of leaving them in a warm pile near the door. Inside, Earl opened both vents wider and told Harlan to leave the mister alone. Harlan looked at the remaining bins. The room that had seemed controlled that morning now looked full of hidden decisions, each one capable of going wrong slowly. Earl picked up the legal pad. "Tomorrow we rebuild it." Harlan reached for the lower shutter. Earl stopped his hand. "Tonight, you do nothing more." The next morning, Earl arrived before sunrise and made Harlan take the room apart by decisions instead of by boards. First came the vents. The lower shutter had been doing too much work because Harlan had treated it like an on and off switch. Earl marked 3 positions on the frame with a carpenter's pencil, one for a mild day, one for a cold night, and one for the hours when outside air dropped hard enough to threaten freezing. The upper vent stayed cracked wider than before, so warm, moist air had somewhere to leave. Second came the bins. They pulled every remaining bin 6 inches away from the wall and opened a hand's width between each row. Where 2 bins had been stacked tight against one another, Earl made Harlan rebuild the rack so air could move around the sides instead of traveling only across the top. Third came the sand. Harlan had been judging moisture by color. Earl made him judge it by feel. He reached into the center of a bin, not the surface, squeezed a handful and let it fall apart across his palm. "You test where the root lives," Earl said, "not where the light hits." Harlan wrote that down. Fourth came the schedule. No more misting because a surface looked pale. No more closing vents because the forecast sounded frightening. Harlan would read the thermometers, check for condensation, feel the sand beneath the surface, smell the room, and inspect a rotating group of bins. Only after those observations could he change anything. The rule was simple enough to fit on one page, which was exactly why Earl wanted it written. For 9 days, the system held. The windows stayed clear. The air smelled like cold soil instead of sweetness. When Harlan lifted sample roots, the crowns were firm and the skins stayed tight. He began to trust the written routine more than his own urge to interfere. Then the weather shifted again. A dry northwest wind settled over Gratiot County and stayed for 4 days. Afternoon humidity outside dropped. The vents carried that dry air through the room, and the upper layers of sand began losing moisture faster than Harlan expected. He had learned the danger of trapping dampness, so now he hesitated to add any back. Earl found the first warning in bin 23. The carrot did not bend, but its skin had begun to wrinkle near the shoulder. Another root from the same bin felt lighter than it should have. In the row nearest the lower vent, several more had lost enough moisture that the crowns were starting to soften from dehydration rather than rot. Harlan looked at Earl. "I went too far the other way." "Yes." Earl's answer came without accusation. Cold storage did not stop water loss. It slowed it. Moving air could protect against condensation, but excessive dry airflow could also pull moisture from the roots. A mother root had to survive winter with enough stored water and carbohydrate left to resume growth after planting. A badly shriveled root might still be alive, but asking it to build leaves, a flower stalk, and seed after months of dehydration was a poor gamble, so they sorted again. This time the rejects were dry, leathery, and light instead of wet and collapsing. Harlan weighed them in smaller batches because none of the bins was full. 110 pounds, 90 pounds, 125, then 85, 410 pounds in all. 7,790 became 7,380. Harlan wrote the number on the legal pad and did not circle it. After that, Earl changed one last part of the system. He stopped coming every morning. At first, he came every other day, then twice a week. He would enter without touching anything, look at Harlan's temperature records, inspect the notes beside each bin number, and ask why a vent had moved or why sand had been dampened. If Harlan could not answer from what he had observed, Earl made him undo the change. One gray morning in November, Harlan asked whether Earl would be back the next day. Earl pulled on his gloves. "No." Harlan looked toward the bins. Earl nodded at the legal pad. "If this only works when I am standing in the room, then you do not have a system. You have me." He drove away before Harlan could answer. For the first time since the carrots came home, 7,380 pounds were going to spend the night under decisions Harlan had made entirely by himself. By the second week of April, the sinker patch had dried enough to take a tractor without swallowing the rear tires. Harlan worked the ground only as deep as he needed, then laid out the rows with Earl's old spacing marks copied onto a scrapboard. The mother roots came out of storage one bin at a time, still cold to the touch, their crowns firm after months in sand. Earl came for the first morning of planting and stayed long enough to watch Harlan set the first dozen. The root went down nearly to the shoulder. The crown stayed level with the soil surface. Harlan pressed the earth around it firmly enough to close air pockets, but not so hard that he bruised the root. "Do not bury the crown," Earl said, "and do not leave the shoulder hanging in the wind." Harlan nodded. By sundown, the first rows ran dark and straight across ground that had not carried a useful crop in years. Over the next 2 days, the rest followed. Some roots were thick and blunt, some were forked, some still looked exactly like the sort of carrot a supermarket buyer would reject without a second glance. Then Harlan waited. For 6 mornings, nothing changed above the soil. The 7th morning came cold and windless. At 4:58, Harlan walked out with a flashlight before making coffee, because sleep had become something he did between inspections. Frost silvered the grass along the ditch, and the plastic covering over the first rows clicked softly where it touched the wire hoops. He stopped beside row 3. There was no sound from the plants, only the distant hum of a truck on the highway and water moving somewhere under the ditch grass. Harlan crouched, turned the flashlight sideways, and held it low across the crowns. One green point had pushed through. It was no longer than the first joint of his little finger, folded tight against itself, bright enough to look almost artificial against the black soil. Harlan did not touch it. He moved to the next crown, then the next. 3 more had started. By sunrise, he had counted 37 visible shoots, and Earl's rule was the only reason Harlan did not dig around the quiet crowns to see what the rest were doing. A root either has enough life left to answer, Earl had told him. You do not pull it up to ask the question twice. That rule mattered because a transplanted mother root had work to do below the surface before Harlan saw much above it. New feeder roots had to establish contact with the surrounding soil. Stored reserves in the carrot supplied energy for new leaves. Disturbing a root to check progress could break those new roots, loosen the soil around them, and turn impatience into damage. So Harlan marked the rows and waited. Over the next 12 days, green spread across most of the patch. Some crowns pushed leaves hard and upright. Others produced weak growth that yellowed, stalled, or collapsed after the first warm afternoons. Harlan and Earl gave the weak plants time, then made one final pass. 560 pounds of the original mother root weight had failed to return with enough vigor to justify carrying them farther. 7,380 became 6,820. Harlan wrote the new number on the legal pad at the edge of the field. This time, he did not look toward Earl for approval. He walked the rows by himself, checking crowns, soil contact, and the first new leaves while the morning warmed. The plants were alive, but survival was no longer the whole job. Before any of them could make seed, Harlan had to keep them alive long enough to flower. By the first week of June, the sinker patch no longer looked like ground people had given up on. The carrot tops had thickened into waist-high growth, and from the centers of the strongest plants, pale green stalks began rising above the leaves. Harlan had seen carrots bolt before in neglected garden rows, but these stalks were not accidents. They were the crop. Earl came out one warm morning and rested his hands on the old fence wire. "Now you quit looking down," he said. Harlan followed his eyes. At first, the flower heads were tight and green, each folded inward like a fist. Then the outer branches spread. The centers opened. By late June, the first umbels turned white above the rows and hundreds more followed. The field changed color almost by the day. From the road, it looked as if somebody had laid a pale sheet across the low ground. Up close, small native bees worked the outer flowers, larger bees pushed across the centers, and beetles crawled through the umbels. The smell was faint, green, and spicy, nothing like the roots that had filled the wash house in October. Harlan walked the rows each evening and marked plants that never developed properly. Some roots had survived storage and produced leaves, but never built a strong flowering stalk. Others sent up thin stems that leaned after rain or stopped before the umbels developed enough to justify keeping them in the seed block. Earl made him remove those plants before they became a distraction from the stronger stand. Harlan weighed the losses by the original root weight recorded for those rows. 420 pounds. 6,820 became 6,400. That number held for the rest of the story. The 11,400 pounds that had come off the packing line were now reduced to 6,400 pounds of mother roots that had survived sorting, storage, winter, replanting, and establishment strongly enough to enter useful seed production. Harlan stood at the south end of the patch one evening, while the sun dropped behind the box elders. The white flower heads caught the last light first. Beneath them, the soil was dark from an afternoon shower, and his boots collected a rim of mud with every step. A pickup slowed on County Road 600. Then it stopped. Daniel Rowe was 54, thick through the middle, with a red beard fading gray, and one elbow hooked through the open window. 3 years earlier, he had lost a greenhouse tomato contract after a buyer rejected fruit for size variation, and he had never stopped resenting standards that could turn edible produce into waste. He called toward Harlan. "What in the world did you plant back there?" "Carrots." Daniel looked at the white field. "Those are carrots?" They were. Daniel shut off the engine and stepped out. Harlan took an old photograph from his shirt pocket, a picture Glenn Mercer had made of the cull pile before loading. Twisted roots, broken shapes, dirt, and orange weight stacked shoulder high. Daniel looked from the photograph to the blooming field. "You grew seed from those?" Harlan nodded. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. It was not disbelief anymore. It was recalculation. A light wind crossed the umbels and the whole patch shifted at once, thousands of white flower heads bending and returning upright. Harlan had not made the crooked carrots straight. He had found the part of them that never needed to be straight in the first place, and before those flowers could become anything Harlan could sell, he still had to learn how to bring the seed home without losing it. By late July, the white field had started turning brown from the top down. The earliest umbels dried first. Their green centers faded to tan, the seed-bearing heads curled inward, and the stems lost the soft bend they had carried during flowering. Lower umbels were still green, which gave Harlan a problem Earl had warned him about but had not yet made him solve. "You cannot wait for the whole plant to agree," Earl said. Harlan wanted one harvest date. One clean day when every head could be cut, carried, dried, and finished together. It would save labor, and labor had become the new shortage. The sinker patch had produced more seed heads than he had racks, more drying material than the wash house could hold at once, and more handwork than one man could finish between chores. So he waited 3 days. On the 4th morning, he found birds in the first row. They lifted in a loose cloud when he came through the gate, leaving dry umbels shaking behind them. Harlan walked to the strongest plants and cupped his palm beneath one head. Brown seed fell into his hand. He touched another umbel, and more dropped. The birds had shown him the problem, but they were not the whole problem. Mature carrot seed did not wait politely for later heads to catch up. Primary umbels ripened ahead of many secondary and tertiary umbels, and seed from the earliest heads could begin dropping if harvest was delayed. A grower trying to harvest everything at one stage could gain maturity in the later heads while losing the best seed from the earliest ones. Earl rubbed a ripe umbel between his fingers. "You are trying to save time by waiting," he said. "Now the field is charging interest." Harlan looked toward the wash house. "What do we cut? What is ready?" That changed the harvest from an event into a routine. They began before sunrise the next morning while dew still held the heads slightly damp. Harlan carried pruning shears and shallow feed sacks. He cut only umbels that had browned and reached the brittle stage Earl wanted, leaving greener heads on the plant. The dampness helped keep loose seed from scattering while the heads were handled. By 7:30, the sun had begun drying the rows, and Harlan stopped. Inside the wash house, he spread the cut umbels in thin layers on old window screens raised above sawhorses. Air could move underneath as well as over them. He did not heap them into sacks, and he did not thresh them while they still carried field moisture. The heads had to finish drying under cover before rubbing and cleaning would release seed efficiently. The next morning, he did it again, then again. The birds still came, but Harlan no longer gave them a whole field of fully ripe heads to work on. More important, he no longer asked the earliest seed to wait for the latest. Every dawn he walked the same route, checked maturity by touch and color, cut what was ready, and left the rest standing. Within a week, the wash house changed purpose again. The winter bins were gone. Drying screens filled the room in tiers, and brown umbels rustled whenever air moved through the open vents. Fine seed collected beneath the racks like coarse dust. The 6,400 pounds in the mother root ledger did not change. That number had already held, but Harlan had entered a different kind of count now, one measured not by roots saved, but by how much clean seed those roots could actually return. And before he could know that number, The weather was about to judge the sinker patch against every field around it. The rain stopped on August 3rd. For the next 17 days, no measurable rain crossed Harlan's gauge, and afternoon temperatures climbed into the upper 80s. The wind came mostly from the southwest, warm enough to dry the crust from a boot print before evening. The damage showed first on higher ground. Daniel Rowe had 4 acres of market carrots on a sandy rise 2 miles east. By the 9th dry day, the outer leaves had folded by noon and his irrigation pump could cover only half the field at a time. He later measured nearly 1 acre where roots had stopped sizing well enough to meet the fresh market grade he needed. Leonard Pike had planted 3.5 acres of late carrots on rented ground south of town. His stand had looked even in July. By mid-August, the lightest section showed gaps where smaller plants had collapsed and he abandoned 0.6 of an acre, rather than keep paying for water on it. Only after Harlan had seen those fields did he walk into the sinker patch and understand what his worst ground was doing. The surface was dry. 2 inches down, it was not. The same low position that made the patch miserable in a wet spring had left moisture beneath the surface after the rest of the farm began hardening. Harlan pushed a soil probe beside one row and brought up a dark core that still held together in his palm. Earl crouched beside a mother root and pulled back the loose soil near its shoulder. "Do not give the field all the credit," he said. "Look at what you planted." A carrot grown for seed in its second season did not begin August with the same body as a seedling. The mother root had spent its first season storing carbohydrates and water in the enlarged taproot. Winter cold had supplied the vernalization needed to shift the plant toward reproduction. After Harlan replanted the roots in spring, new feeder roots developed around them while leaves rebuilt above ground. By summer, those plants still needed water. A stored root was not a magic tank, and prolonged drought could reduce flowering, seed fill, and final seed quality. But Harlan's plants had entered the dry period with something a newly germinated crop did not have: a large reserve organ already beneath the crown, plus months of established growth after transplanting. The sinker patch added the second advantage. Its heavier soil and low position held water longer than Daniel's sandy rise. Harlan had also planted the mother roots on slightly raised row shoulders, so spring water could leave the crowns instead of standing against them. In a wet season, that ground demanded drainage. In this dry stretch, the same ground released stored moisture slowly enough to keep the plants from collapsing between irrigations. What had looked like 2 liabilities had begun covering each other's weakness. Harlan still irrigated. He ran water in the evening when wind loss was lower and checked soil below the surface before deciding whether another pass was needed. He stopped judging drought by the color of the top inch, just as Earl had taught him not to judge storage sand by its surface. By August 20th, Daniel's field carried pale edges, and Leonard's abandoned section had gone flat against the soil. The sinker patch was no longer white with flowers. Its umbels had browned, curled inward and filled with seed, while the lower stems remained firm enough to hold them above the ground. Earl stood at the gate and watched Harlan carry another tray of cut heads toward the wash house. For months, people had treated the project as a strange use for crooked carrots. The weather had just made it valuable. That afternoon, a black pickup Harlan did not recognize stopped beside the field. The driver stayed inside for nearly 5 minutes, watching Harlan carry seed heads through the wash house door. The next morning, the same truck was parked at Mercer Packing Shed. Nolan Pierce came to the farm on August 22nd in the same black pickup Harlan had seen beside the sinker patch. He was 52, compact and clean-shaven, with iron-gray hair combed straight back and a habit of keeping his shirt cuffs buttoned even in heat. 15 years earlier, a seed company he had helped build nearly collapsed after 2 growers broke delivery agreements in the same season. Nolan recovered by becoming the man who put every promise on paper and every useful crop under contract before somebody else could. He stood at the edge of the wash house while Harlan rubbed dried umbels over a screen. "I hear you have 100 pounds or better coming. I do not know what I have yet. You will." Nolan stepped closer to the trays. He represented several regional garden suppliers and independent farm stores. He bought small lots, combined them, arranged cleaning and packaging, and sold reliability to businesses that could not afford an empty seed rack in spring. His first offer sounded reasonable. He would take the entire cleaned lot after germination testing, pay Harlan $4.80 per pound, and handle every bag, invoice, and customer after that. Harlan had already spent more than that in labor, but not much more in cash. Nolan knew the difference. "You get one check," Nolan said. "No phone calls, no little orders, no chasing people for $30. Harlan asked what Nolan expected to charge. "That is my end." Harlan looked through the doorway toward the brown field. "No." Nolan did not raise his voice. "Think on it." 3 days later, he came back without an offer. This time, he carried a copy of Mercer Packing Shed's standard grower agreement, the form used for carrot crops delivered under contract. Nolan pointed to language covering rejected product and disposal. His argument was that culls generated under the packing agreement remained controlled by the shed until disposal was complete, and that Harlan's dollar receipt could not create a seed right the shed itself had never intended to sell. Glenn Mercer came to the wash house that afternoon. Nolan laid the agreement on the bench. Glenn read it once, then asked Harlan for the yellow receipt. Harlan unlocked the metal cash box behind the truck seat and brought it inside. The paper had softened at the folds, but Glenn's handwriting was clear. Lot 14C, 11,400 pounds, sold and transferred in full to Harlan Petrie for $1. Removal and responsibility passing to the buyer upon pickup. Nolan read it twice. Glenn tapped his signature. "I sold him the lot." Nolan looked at Glenn. "You sold culls." "I sold what the paper says I sold." There was no shouting. Nolan folded his copy of the grower agreement, slid it back into his folder, and left. The third move took longer to see. Harlan finished drying the earliest seed heads and began calling small garden stores within 60 miles. The first two asked for germination results. The third asked what variety it was. The fourth, Granger Farm and Garden, had spoken with him for nearly 10 minutes the week before and said they could probably take 25 pounds if the test was strong. Now the answer changed. Miriam Granger was 46, heavy-set, with copper-framed glasses and a blue apron she wore even behind the office desk. 7 years earlier, she had stocked seed from a supplier who failed to replace a poor germinating lot, and customers had blamed her store instead of the supplier. Since then, she bought only from people she believed would still answer the phone after planting season. "Harlan," she said, "I cannot put you on the spring rack." "What changed?" A pause came over the line. "Nolan Pierce supplies 3 of my main vegetable lines." Harlan understood before she finished. "He said if I buy your carrot seed, he will reconsider my account." The next store gave Harlan almost the same answer. Then a small mail-order catalog declined without explanation. A greenhouse outside Mount Pleasant canceled a meeting. By Friday, Harlan had 6 names crossed off the page. 6,400 pounds of mother roots had done their job. The seed was coming into the wash house every morning, brown and dry and real. The ledger had held exactly where Earl said it would. But a crop was not income because it existed. Harlan stood at the workbench with the telephone beside his elbow and the old $1 receipt under his hand. Nolan had failed to buy the seed and failed to take the roots away from him. Now he was trying something simpler. He was making sure Harlan had nowhere to sell what they produced. Harlan stopped calling stores on Monday morning. 6 names had been crossed off the legal pad, and every new call felt like another chance for Nolan Pierce to reach the buyer first. Earl looked at the page, then at the drying screens. "You keep asking for somebody else's road," he said. "Build one." The first step was proving what Harlan actually had. When the umbels were fully dry, he rubbed them over coarse screen, breaking the seed loose without grinding it. A second screen removed larger stem pieces. Then he poured the rough seed slowly in front of a low fan, letting lighter chaff drift aside while heavier seed dropped into a clean tub. Cleaning did not prove life. For that, Harlan took counted samples from different parts of the lot. He placed 100 seeds at a time on moist blotting paper, kept them damp without standing water, and watched for normal seedlings rather than counting every seed that merely cracked. Carrot seed could be slow, so he recorded each count by date instead of declaring failure after a few days. The first complete sample produced 84 normal seedlings. The second produced 83. The third produced 85. Harlan wrote 84% as the working average. It was not perfection. It was a number he could show. He also kept the packing record identifying the rejected roots as one open pollinated carrot lot, along with Earl's field notes on removing flowering wild carrot near the seed patch. A buyer did not have to trust Harlan's memory. The paper was there. Miriam Granger came to the farm 2 days later. She walked through the wash house wearing the same blue apron she wore at Granger Farm and Garden. Harlan showed her the cleaned seed, the germination sheets, and the field notes. He did not tell her the lot was better than it was. 84%, Miriam said. That is what my tests say. And if somebody gets less? I want them to call me. 7 years earlier, Miriam had been left defending a poor seed lot while the supplier stopped returning calls. Nolan knew that history, which was why threatening her account had worked. She picked up one packet. I will not give you the whole rack. I did not ask for it. I will give you one shelf. That was the first opening. Daniel Rowe took 5 pounds for his market garden and told 2 growers at the Saturday market where he got it. Miriam accepted small deliveries instead of one large order, reducing her risk. Harlan packed larger lots for growers planting by the acre and smaller packets for gardeners planting 1 row. The cheapest seed did not go to the biggest customer. It went to Evelyn Shaw. Evelyn Shaw was 63, thin, with a brown canvas coat too large through the shoulders and gray hair twisted beneath a green scarf. Her husband, Peter, had died the previous winter after a stroke, leaving her with 12 acres, 2 old hoop houses, and enough debt that she stopped heating one house before February ended. She came carrying a paper with the amount of seed she could afford. Harlan read it. That will not cover what you need. I know. Then I plant less. Harlan weighed enough for the beds she had prepared and charged close to what cleaning, testing, and packing had cost him. Evelyn looked at the figure. You do not have to do that. I know, Harlan said. I am doing it anyway. She paid, set the seed box on her passenger floor, and drove home. By September, orders no longer came through one road. They came through Daniel, through Miriam's single shelf, through growers who had seen Harlan's records, and through handwritten notes passed between farmers at the market. Nolan still controlled larger doors. Harlan had begun building smaller ones. The 6,400 pounds in the mother root ledger remained unchanged. The wash house now held bags of cleaned seed instead of bins of rejected carrots, but Harlan still had one calculation left to make. He needed to know whether all those small doors added up to enough money to keep the farm. By the middle of September, the last cleaned seed had been weighed, the last germination sheet had been dated, and Harlan finally knew what the field had returned. 148 pounds of cleaned carrot seed sat on the scale records. 96 pounds had gone to regular buyers, some in larger grower lots, some through Miriam Granger's store, and some in small packets that took more labor but brought a better price. 22 pounds had gone near cost to growers like Evelyn Shaw. 18 pounds stayed on Harlan's farm for his own planting. 12 pounds remained sealed for germination checks, swaps, and the next season's stock. 96, plus 22, plus 18, plus 12. 148 pounds. The mother root ledger closed just as plainly. 11,400 pounds had arrived from Mercer Packing Shed. 1,260 had left because crowns were cut or badly wounded. 980 had left with soft rot and decay. 640 had been too weak, too undersized, or too badly damaged to carry through storage. 730 had been lost when Harlan trapped too much moisture and too little air around the roots. 410 had dried beyond what Earl trusted. 560 failed to return strongly after replanting. 420 never made useful flowering plants. What remained was 6,400 pounds of mother roots. That number had held. The money came through many small doors instead of one large one. Harlan's regular sales brought $6,901. The 22 pounds sold near cost brought another $374, $7,275 in all. The December bank problem had not disappeared while the carrots slept. First County Agricultural Bank had extended the exact $4,820 Harlan could not cover, securing the extension against his tractor until September 30th. Harlan carried a cashier's check into the bank 9 days before that deadline. Then he spent $620 replacing the worst section of roof over the wash house. $845 went into new pipe and fittings for the irrigation line serving the sinker patch. $310 bought lumber, mesh, and hardware for a proper seed cleaning bench. After those payments, $680 remained. It was not enough money to make Harlan wealthy. It was enough to stop several broken things from becoming emergencies. The yellow legal pad mattered almost as much. Its pages held storage temperatures, vent positions, moisture notes, every subtraction from the original lot, planting dates, bloom observations, harvest dates, cleaning weights, and germination counts. When Miriam asked why she should take a second order, Harlan did not give her a promise. He showed her the records. By October, Earl was coming to the farm only once every week or two. One afternoon, Harlan found him sitting at the wash house bench with the legal pad open in front of him. Earl ran one stiff finger down a page without turning it. "I figured I was going to be the last man around here who knew how to keep a carrot root for seed," Earl said. Harlan leaned against the bench. Earl kept looking at the page. "I was not afraid of dying," he said. "I was afraid this would." He closed the pad and pushed it toward Harlan. Outside, the sinker patch was brown and nearly empty, but 18 pounds of seed were already set aside for spring. The next question was who would learn what to do with them. The next spring, the sinker patch turned green before Harlan expected. Volunteer rye covered the low spots, the box elders opened along the west edge, and the washhouse roof no longer leaked over the workbench. Inside, the yellow legal pad sat beside 3 paper envelopes marked with planting dates. Earl came less often. His hands had stiffened through winter, and on cold mornings he carried one glove in his pocket because pulling it over his right fingers took too long. But when he did come, he no longer checked Harlan's work first. He watched. On an April morning, Evelyn Shaw backed her pickup beside the washhouse with 2 empty flats in the bed. She had not come to buy seed. Her first planting from Harlan's lot had emerged well enough that she still had seed left, and she wanted to help prepare the next mother root rows. "You showed me how to get through one season," she said. "I can give you a morning." Daniel Rowe arrived later with his grandson, Caleb Rowe, 17, tall and narrow, with dirt already ground into the knees of his jeans. Caleb had worked summers in Daniel's greenhouse but had never selected roots for seed. Harlan showed him what mattered: firm crown, sound tissue, enough root to carry reserves. No soft rot. No pity for a root that could spread trouble. Caleb picked up a forked carrot. "This one is ugly." Harlan pressed the crown with his thumb, checked the shoulder, and handed it back. "Crooked isn't the same as useless." Caleb placed it with the keepers. By May, the knowledge had begun moving without anyone announcing it. Miriam Granger kept copies of Harlan's germination records behind the seed counter, so customers could see the numbers for themselves. Daniel Rowe tried a small mother root patch on his own ground. Evelyn Shaw saved her healthiest roots from an early planting and wrote Harlan's storage checks inside an old seed catalog. Earl noticed before Harlan did. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the sinker patch while Caleb measured row spacing with the same scrapboard Earl had used the year before. The boy corrected one root, stepped back, then corrected the next without being told. Earl watched him for a long time. He said nothing. Near the washhouse, one physical mark from the beginning was still there. A narrow, rust-colored streak ran beneath the old loading door, left where carrot juice and wet soil had stained the concrete during the first unloading. Most of the orange marks had faded through winter. That one had not. Harlan never scrubbed it away. The second season was not perfect. A spring storm flattened part of the rye. Cold rain delayed planting 4 days, 2 germination tests ran below the 84% average from the year before, and Harlan discarded one small lot because he did not trust its vigor. Some of the first year had depended on timing. Some depended on Earl. Some depended on the good fortune that the rejected carrots had come from an open-pollinated crop worth carrying forward. Harlan knew that. He also knew luck had not opened the vents, cut away the rotten roots, kept the records, harvested ripe umbels before the birds took them, or answered the telephone after Nolan Pierce closed the larger doors. By June, the first second-generation flower stalks began rising. Earl came to see them on a Sunday afternoon. Harlan found him standing by the fence, hat in both hands. For months, Earl had talked about temperature, moisture, root condition, timing, and seed. That afternoon, he used different words. "A man can work a piece of ground a long time," he said, "and still not be the one who makes anything live." The wind moved across the carrot tops. We keep the rot out. We give air when it needs air, water when it needs water. We plant when the ground is ready. After that, there is a whole lot happening under the dirt that never asks our permission. Harlan looked across the field, roots storing strength through winter, seeds opening where nobody could see them, knowledge passing from one pair of hands to another before anyone noticed it had moved. There was work in all of it, and there was mercy in being allowed to see the result. Harlan did not believe the 11,400 pounds of rejected carrots had been sent to him as a reward. He believed something quieter. He believed God had given people eyes, judgment, patience, and one another, and that sometimes provision arrived looking nothing like provision at first. The grocery buyers had counted shape. Harlan had learned to count what could still live. Crooked was never the same as useless. Not every discarded thing could be saved. Hard work did not guarantee an easy ending. But sometimes value stayed hidden long enough to require faith before there was evidence. If this story reminded you of someone carrying work nobody else understands yet, share it with them. And if you have ever seen something useful saved after everyone else had written it off, tell us about it in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe if you want more farm stories about patience, second chances, and the work that keeps going before anyone can see what is growing.